How are you doing? You're very welcome to the Michael Harding podcast. Friday afternoon, every weekend, I talk to you. And sometimes I talk about the old religion. And sometimes I talk about Buddhism, which I'd say is a kind of a philosophy. And I never talk as a teacher or as a psychotherapist or as a professor or as an academic. I talk to you as a storyteller, sharing you the story of my life. And that's all I'm doing. And I think that for me, the greatest way to live, the greatest philosophy, the greatest practice, the greatest therapy is storytelling. To share with you who I am. Knowing, for example, that it changes from day to day. I'm not the same person today as I was yesterday. I'm not the same person today as I will be in a week's time. It's amazing how we change. Like the weather. Emotions run through us and we're different every day. And like in the Buddhist way, you'd say, well, is there any consistent self in there? You know? The non-existence of self to talk about. Like that when you really try and examine who the self is, you find you're simply in each moment reacting to the context of that moment, and that there's no kind of ontological, substantial you that's there, like, oh, this is me. You're always changing. And that's a really nice kind of idea, because it means that you always have possibilities to transform in this present moment. Do you know something? There's a funny thing happens to me when I turn on the microphone. It's like a trigger. That's the best way to put it. And I'm in my room all day today. I'm writing a column. I'm writing a little essay for a primary school up in West Cavan in Glengevlin for their magazine. The school is 90 years old today, or not today, but this year. I'm doing these various little things and I'm writing away, and that's fine. But then I get out the equipment for doing the podcast and I plug in the microphone and I get on the headphones and then I press the button. And at that stage, I'm triggered into talking to you like we were just in the pub or in a coffee shop having a coffee. Or like I was just on the phone. And so I can't resist starting to philosophize and starting to talk all big, profound ideas like the non-existence of self. And I'm apologizing for that. And the reason I am is because I did promise that for this month, you know, from the 22nd of June onwards, starting last week, I was going to share something from each of the 7 memoirs that I have now written. I can't believe that I have written 7 books in this little room. This little room being my studio shed in the hills above Loch Allen. I can't believe. I do look at the books and think, did I write that? Well, I did, and I'm going to read you this week. First week, we're going to look at and read from a book called Staring at Lakes. And I suppose all I'm trying to do is give you a taste of it. If you already know the book and you've already read it, then it just might be pleasant to refresh and to hear me reading it. Alternatively, if you never read the books, you might be motivated to go and get one. And I think this is a good idea for holiday period. So I'm thinking holiday period now from this point at the end of June, probably until very early in August. One of the big religious feasts that matters to me is the Transfiguration, the 6th of August. It is a beautiful feast. It's a wonderful idea. One of the people who was there in the Transfiguration, who experienced the Transfiguration of Jesus the Christ, saw him at the top of the mountain talking to Elijah and Moses. You know, it's a great story. It's worth looking at. But one of the big people there was James and John. And James was the Saint James who later went to Spain. And they found, in about the 9th century, they found his remains. And so the place that grew up is Santiago de Compostela, Santiago meaning St. James, one of the apostles. And it became a huge centre of pilgrimage, competing with Rome and Jerusalem. It became a really big centre for European pilgrimage to go to where St. James, the Apostle James, one of the people who was there on the top of the mountain when there was this moment of transfiguration, when Jesus Christ spoke to Moses and spoke to the prophet Elijah. So that whole connection with Santiago developed Santiago as a great centre for pilgrimage. There's an awful lot of Irish people go there. The monks used to go there in the 12th and 13th and 14th century from Ireland. And when they were digging up monks, they were excavating a whole lot of archaeological sites in Mullingar about 10 or 15 years ago. And they found bones of monks. When they were excavating a place that they eventually put in a car park. I don't know how kind of enlightened that was, but I suppose you do need the car park still, so long as you have cars. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. What I was going to say was, when they dug up the monks, the old bones, they found that many of them had shells. They had been buried with the shell around their neck, and that shell is the symbol of somebody who has done the Camino, the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. So people from Ireland have been doing that pilgrimage for many, many years. And here's the story. At the end of August, I am hoping to do it. I'm hoping to do a short bit of it, maybe 120 kilometres, from the town of Sarria on the French way into Santiago. I'm going to start out on the 17th of August. I suppose I'm doing it just for health reasons, but also for a sense of gratitude that I have that, my health did recover. I had 2 difficult years, and I'm just feeling grateful. And I'm feeling grateful for being able to walk, because it was my legs that came under threat when I was having a bit of bad health. And so it's like, well, what better way to give thanks and celebrate the sense that your legs are able to walk? Go for a pilgrimage, go walking. So when I get back to the 6th of August and into that end of the year, like the end of August, I would hope to be reflecting profoundly on how I feel about my faith. And when I say my faith, I mean Buddhist faith, and I mean it as the foundation of Christian faith. I mean that for me, the practice of Buddhism and the philosophical ideas of Buddhism and the psychotherapeutic dimension or glance of Buddhism, those to me are the absolutely foundational ways of perception that I have. I'm not saying that they're true. I'm saying that Buddhism is the way that I look at the world. Seems to me most naturally true. But when I look in that way, when I kind of try and collect myself in a state of calm abiding in Buddhist terms, I usually find that the whole Christian faith then begins to kind of shine for me. That the two are not actually an opposite, but that your Christian prayerful life flows, for me anyway, it flows out of Buddhism. It's like I have calm abiding, and I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha, the enlightened one, the enlightened consciousness. Now, what could be more closer to the idea of the transcendent God? The Dharma is, to take refuge in the Dharma is like ultimate reality and all that leads to ultimate reality. And in a sense, the Dharma is whatever is the right teachings for you. Like it could be that you're a student of philosophy, or it could be you're a student of medicine. Could be that you're a student of literature. Could be that you're a journalist. Could be that you're a gardener. You read books about the garden. Whatever is the good knowledge in your world, in your field, I see that as the Dharma. It is, the pathways towards ultimate truth. Could be mathematics. And so for me, even though I say the Dharma, you think, well, that means Buddhist teachings. No, it also means Christian teachings. It means the teachings that I find are true and helpful. Teachings that, as the Dalai Lama would say, are useful. Very useful teachings if they help you get into a good space in your mind, and that you're able to bring your mind into your body and into your heart and feel that you're physically embodying compassion, that you're feeling a really good feeling of warmth and love to other people, and also that you're feeling a sense of forgiveness to other people, that there's no little fucking, little residues of bitterness and hatred and negativity that you nurture, that you kind of hide away in your heart. You just forgive. I've done the prayer with you before. That there's a prayer with the determination to accomplish the highest welfare of all sentient beings who surpass even a wish-granting jewel. I will learn to hold them supremely clear. And that prayer goes on. So you could get the first sentence of that and just Google it, and you get the whole prayer up. Or you could find it, because I did a podcast earlier, about 6 months ago, just on that prayer. It's a Buddhist prayer of compassion, forgiveness, and how to live a life of happiness because you hold absolutely no grudge for anybody. It's really, really useful. So when I said the Dharma, I mean Buddhist teachings, but I also mean the Gospels. I mean all the wonderful, rich books there are in the Orthodox tradition, in the Roman Catholic tradition, in the Protestant tradition, all the wonderful books by great theologians, philosophers, and mystics. It's all the Dharma. And finally, you take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the Sangha is the community of those who believe. It's to rely on people who are in themselves reliable. Well, again, you might think the Sangha is, in some sort of old-fashioned terms, it would be the ordained members or community in a Buddhist tradition. So it would be like all the lamas in the Tibetan tradition, you'd call them the Sangha. Well, I go again much wider than that. I think the Sangha is the people around you who share faith. And it may not even be Christian or Buddhist or Islamic. It may not be the faith that is officially like exactly the same as we're all Catholics or we're all Muslims. No. There's a way that faith is universal. There's a way that I would consider people of faith in the Muslim tradition to be part of the Sangha. They are the community of faith that uphold me, even though I might be a Christian. As well as the Tibetan lamas and all the other lamas and all the other people, people who dedicate themselves to following the teachings in a formal way. Nuns in the Buddhist, Christian, Orthodox, all traditions. The idea of Sangha for me transcends the ideology of one religion. It's a community of believing, and you know it when you look in somebody's eyes. You're in a restaurant and you're looking at a stranger and you know that they have faith. You might not know their name, but you know somebody who has faith, somebody who prays, somebody who doesn't see the world either from an egoistic point of view completely, like the meaning of life is that I survive and I have to look after myself, or it's not even people who believe that kind of selfish attitude, but also there's people, an awful lot of people there, it seems to me that the world in the West is becoming more and more about just hanging on to some collective and trusting that somebody is driving the train. It's not that you're exploring it for yourself. So we're living at the surface instead of at the depth. And to live in the depth of your being is to pray. And so if somebody prays, whether they be Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, or secularist, if they have a prayer life, a way whereby through meditation, whatever, they go inside and try and find a threshold where they feel that, not that they're looking at anything, but that they belong, they are being looked at. You don't go inside, to penetrate the mystery of the universe. You go inside in your meditation so that the universe may penetrate you. You become passive and open into silence. And the silence will teach you everything. So that's the way I say, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And I find it hard to contain myself. I can never stop talking about stuff like this and enthusing about it. But I did promise that I would bring in a different layer of fun into the podcast for the summer. From now until somewhere in the end of August, we'll start up again with all those meditations. And particularly, I will be really excited about starting up those meditations in relation to how I will be making a journey, a camino, a pilgrimage to Santiago in Spain. So that's to come. But for now, for holiday, for fun, I was going to read you each week. I'll take a different book, starting with the first one. The first book I wrote was Priest, the second was The Trouble with Sarah Gullion, and the third was Bird in the Snow. I wrote those three, they were novels, and I had them finished by the mid-90s. But when I came into the 21st century, like 2010, I started a new chapter, if you like, in my life, a new phase, where I began writing memoir. And it has become my whole life now, for 14 years. And it comes out of what I used to write, and still do write in the newspaper, the Irish Times, every week. Story. But I began to write in book form, and I'm going to read you a little bit now, and it's from Staring at Lakes. I hope you enjoy it, and I'm very sorry for going on, rattling on again about the whole religion thing. I can't be stopped, Anyway, Rabsal was the name of a monk. Rabsal the monk, with the hooded eyes, came to me every day with buckets of dumplings and rice and bottles of orange and buckets of horse's milk. He told me not to leave the monastery on my own, but sometimes we walked together up the road, between the huckster shops, and through the shanty town, and past other monasteries. One day he spoke to me about his mother. When he was finished, I felt an urge to phone my own mother, to tell her that I loved her. But there were no phones in Ulaanbaatar, no phones that we could find. So instead, I told Rabsal that I'd like to go to the post office and send some postcards. It was Wednesday afternoon, and it was hot in Ulaanbaatar. The streets were dry and dusty, and little children in bare feet followed us all the way. At one point, Rabsal bought them donuts and took their photographs. There was a rack of postcards on sale inside the door of the post office. Pictures of yaks, Mongolians in traditional hats, sitting on horses, archers, wrestlers, images of Buddha or Genghis Khan. I sent postcards to Dublin, Cork, Belfast, Cavan and Bonboy. And to my mother I wrote, "Hi ma'am, here among the yaks, having a great time, love you very much." I felt better after that, but it was even hotter as we walked back. And we had to watch the dusty tracks in the shantytown because the ground was covered with dog poo and we were in sandals. And there were lots of dogs in the shantytown, wolf-like creatures with amber eyes stalking strangers, and huckster shops on the corners, little galvanized huts selling religious trinkets, which reminded me of the Marian shrine in Knock in the summers of my childhood. "Where are we going?" I asked, when I realized that Rabsal was not heading back directly to the monastery. "To a hospital," he said. "New hospital." In fact, he brought me to a building site, an empty shell without water, sanitation or toilet plumbing, and of course no patients. In its cavernous interior, we roamed for half an hour with cement dust in our noses, looking for the Frenchwoman. She was tall and grey-haired, and spoke with ferocious zeal about her intentions regarding maternity units, showers, baths, and toilets. "And all will be free," she declared, "for the poor." Then, after spending as long as one can staring at a building site, I asked Rabsal what we should do next. "Post office," he said. "But we've been there," I said. "No," he said, "we must make phone call." So off we went in the heat back to the post office, which was a mile away. Making a phone call was far more complicated than just posting a letter. Inside the post office, there were rows of telephone kiosks. First, we checked in at reception and took a form. The form required us to fill in a name, address, and the phone number that we wanted to call. This Rabsal did, and handed it in at another glass window. From here we were directed upstairs to kiosk number 25. So up we went and waited for the phone to ring. Rabsal was phoning his niece in Moscow. When the phone rang, he lifted the receiver, but all he could hear was an engaged tone. So we tried again, going through all the same rituals. We tried 4 times. An hour had passed. "Maybe phone number wrong. What to do now?" he said, looking terribly disappointed. I watched him for a while as he stood still, and his logic seemed to be that since we had come to make a phone call, we shouldn't be deterred because this particular number didn't answer. "I make call to Beijing instead," he suggested. So we rang a Beijing number. There was no reason to call, and we got through to an old woman who was mystified as to why we were calling her from Mongolia. And because she spoke English better than Rabsal spoke Chinese, I was put on to talk with her. I explained that I was Irish and that I was standing beside a Mongolian who was a friend of her son. But neither of us actually knew her. She said it was raining in Beijing, and that opened up possibilities. We talked about the weather for a long time. Then I whispered to the now gleeful Rabsal beside me, "What else will I say? Tell me quick, what am I calling?" The woman in China also wanted to know why we were calling. Rabsal seemed perplexed. "Oh yes," he exclaimed, "you thank her for the milk." And so I thanked her for the dried milk her son had sent the previous winter when it was very cold. And that completed our mission. And that was Wednesday. We had planned a phone call, and we had made a phone call. The day had been a success. Rabsal walked me home and left me in the monastery, and I saw him out to the gate and down the road to wherever he was staying. Because he was not staying with Rinpoche, and I did not know from whence he came each day, or to where he went each evening when he bade me farewell. He came back in the following day, as usual, with more dumplings and milk and stories of his childhood, and after a week I imagined that I knew him very well. Rabsal was born from the womb of a very beautiful young woman, in a tent covered with snow. He was that mother's only child, though there were cousins his own age in nearby tents. It was a huge family of many people, in many tents, surrounded by an abundance of sheep. His father was old. He was small and thin and unpleasant, like a snake standing erect, with huge ears, and in his throat a constant whistle of wind. In those days, all the young children would eat dried fruit, which they called old people's ears. Rabsal called them father's ears. His father was a threat, a dangerous being, a little emperor on the hills, with his 2 tents and his few hundred animals. He sat on the grass in summer, motionless, like a log of wood in the forest, a felled tree. There was also something hurt in him that was not spoken. If you went close, you could feel the anger of his still body like the heat of a fire. He wore a peaked cap, black and greasy. Beneath it, his face was a coconut with wisps of beard under his chin. A cigarette always in his mouth. He passed his days watching people, as sly as an unwanted cat. In my imagination, Tibet was wandering around in tents, following animals, playing with bells, stirring soup, smoking pipes. The coldest part of the night was just after dark until bedtime. Rabsal's young cheeks burned with the cold air, and he sat in the corner of the tent dreaming of monasteries. He did not desire cattle. He did not desire horses. He did not desire yaks. He did not desire a wife or child, or to be beautiful and be praised by the village. All these he controlled with the lash of the cold wind. The only thing he desired was a monastery, and that, he thought, was a proper desire, a noble desire. It was a desire that would make him strong and make his mother proud. How wonderful to be inside the walls of a monastery, learning to read, with a warm stove and an old Mongolian teacher to shorten the evenings, with stories like The Empty Pot and The Upside-Down Pot, and the pot with the hole at the bottom. At night he would sometimes stand out with the horses. The horses kicked the wind. They were angry with the cold air. Rabsal spoke to them. "Don't be disappointed with the cold wind. I am also disappointed. You want shelter, but I, Rabsal, wish for a monastery. we are not so different. He rubbed the horse's nose and stared into its eyes until the horse settled. I am Buddha, he whispered, and the horse whinnied with fright, and Rabsal fell in the snow laughing. The old man was turning into air, a shadow in the corner, always in the dark of the tent now, even through the hot summer, on the bed, yellow in the face, a putrid smell from his piss. He was in pain when he moved, his legs swollen with sores, and his tooth ached in the middle of the night. One day he turned to his son and said, "You are born stupid. You will never get a wife." "I don't want a wife," Rabsal said. "I want to go to the monastery." The old man laughed till it hurt his ribs, and he coughed black phlegm up as his laughter turned to choking. The following day he was dead. His body was washed and taken away for a sky burial, up the hill to be chopped to pieces and fed to the vultures. Rabsal did not cry. Soon after they had taken the body away, he went out with a bucket to fill it with snow for the cooking. When he was there in the open space, the white light of the snow filled his head, and for the first time he realized his father was gone. It felt as if the world was beautiful and empty, and it made him dizzy. He brought the snow bucket into the tent and placed it over the stove and made a brew of good tea with butter for his mother, who sat in the corner fingering her beads. When the tea was ready, he took a surprise out of his pocket and wrapped it in a white scarf and handed it to her with both hands outstretched and his body bent low before her. His mother opened the scarf slowly and discovered 2 little plastic Buddhas, each one no bigger than the top of her thumb. She lifted them as if she were taking eggs from a nest and looking lovingly at her son. The darkness had gone from their tent. "Where did you get them?" she asked, but he never told her. By springtime of the following year, the smell of stale piss was completely gone. The fragrance of jasmine, milk and butter filled the tent. His mother would unwind her long hair from her headscarf and gazed at him through the shafts of sunlight that flooded down through the gap in the roof. Summer was like that. The animals minded themselves, and she did indeed loosen her skirts and ache with joy. But Rabsal was unprepared for the cause of his mother's bliss. Another man had come, a man with a moustache and a gap between his front teeth. He patted Rabsal on the head. They said that at first he had come to mind the animals, but he ended up minding everyone. His name was Sarah. That winter he minded Rabsal's mother. Wanu, he called her. Rabsal had never heard her called that. Wanu. The first thing Rabsal saw each morning in the tent was Sarah, wiry and watchful, standing over the stove with bread in his hand. The emptiness of the world had not lasted long. But one day Wanu and Sarah had a row. It was just before Sarah headed off on one of his journeys. Each month he made a journey to the town. He would be gone for 4 or 5 days. "I would need to be a magician," Sarah was complaining, "to remember all you tell me." "Then write it down," Wanu said. "This is the modern age. We can hear things on the radio now. We must live like other people. But your lists are endless, he said, waving the paper in her face. Look, powders and creams, that's all this is. There are more important things for me to remember. He rushed through the door of the tent in his long coat. She went after him. Rabsal watched as they argued across the back of the pack mule. Then they made up. He could tell because Wanu was buttoning up Sarah's coat to the chin, and she was rubbing the back of her hand on his frozen moustache to take the snow away. And then Sarah squeezed her. Wanu was slight and delicate, like a flower, and the big hero in his coat was winding his arms around her and lifting her off her feet. They both returned to the tent. Wanu was crying. Sarah was crying. They sat down, and after a while he took off his coat and Wanu poured him a bowl of soup, and then she said, "It's late, you must wait until tomorrow." All evening there was peace and silence in the tent, and Rabsal was drawn into it. The two grown-ups made love under the blankets, and Rabsal closed his eyes and dreamed of a monastery where big birds hung from hooks on the wall ready for the cooking pot. He dreamed of kitchen tables laden with vegetables, and prayer halls of polished bowls, and silver candle holders, and silk prayer flags, and giant thankas, Tibetan silk paintings, hanging from the roof, and drums and pipes and cushions and stoves, and old monks, and bottles of snuff, and shelves of hats, and corridors of voices. The bodies beneath the blanket lay still. Sarah ladled himself another bowl of soup, and Wanu raddled the fire and placed dry dung on the hot ash to redden the stove once more. "I couldn't bear prison," Sarah was saying. "I would go mad." The fire was blazing. Rabsal was pretending to sleep, but he heard it all. "I couldn't bear prison." They were staring into the fire. They were frightened. Outside a dog barked. They all listened. His mother got up and made herself ready to sleep on her own couch. Sarah stayed at the fire, his back against a bed box, his eyes open and focused on some distant world. The dog barked through the night. The snow whispered in the tent. Every time Rabsal turned, he woke. And every time he woke, he saw the steady hawk eyes of Sarah gazing into the fire. In the morning, the fire was blazing, the stove was red hot, and no one asked about the dog. Rabsal and his mother had sleep in their eyes and in their mouths. They wrapped themselves in blankets and savoured the hot tea that Sarah had made. The tea washed away their dreams as they sat at the warm, blazing fire he had kept on all night. Sarah belted his coat in the tent and covered his face with a scarf. He pulled the fur hat down over his ears and onto his eyebrows. Rabsal was a happy cat by the fire, the pleasure of remaining when someone else is leaving. And Sarah left without a word. When he was gone, they sat listening to the horses protest, the muffled sound of hooves in the snow for a few seconds. But before he was 20 meters away from them, there was complete silence. The few days that followed were calm, so white and still and so gentle that Rabsal and his mother walked around without anxiety, following their routines as if in a dream. I suppose most of that story was told to me by the monk. And even in broken English, he'd be trying to explain what life was like as a young boy growing up, totally attached to his mother, not getting on well with his father, feeling disturbed when a new lover arrived to his mother. He was telling me all that, and I was thinking that the relationship he has with his mother is so intense in simple things. And I thought I'd love to write that as a story. So I began to fill in the detail, if you like. I began to fill it in, I suppose, from my own imagination, or maybe from the context of my own life, because, you know, when somebody talks about their mother, you're actually thinking immediately about your own mother. And I connected with him because he was telling me a story about his mother. And I would look into his eyes, and here is a Tibetan monk, born and reared in Tibet, and who then ends up in a monastery in Mongolia, and he's talking to me from Ireland, and I'm looking at him like he is my brother. I feel that connection with him. I haven't been in touch with him for decades, but I still feel connected, and every so often I see him on Facebook, and every so often I leave a message for him, and it's like I had that moment of intimacy where he was trying to share something about the relationship he had with his mother. And I think in some way he was so attached to his mother and missed her so much. It was tied up with the whole idea of being a monk. You know, the sense of loneliness and solitude that you can experience when you go on the spiritual journey in life. Because in a way, the spiritual journey is a journey that you can't bring anybody with you. You can come and go, you know, you can come and go to your family. You can come and go to your children. You can be with your family, but there is a little bit inside you that is different and separate and can never be communicated with other people. And that little bit, you've two choices with it. Either you just leave it there as an empty space, and so you're constantly going out to your family to compensate for that empty space, you know, to try and find an intimacy and a joy and sexual pleasure and familial pleasures and just sharing with your family and your children. And you try and find it, you're going out to it to find it, because in some way it alleviates the awful feeling that you get at some little core in your being where you feel empty and rotten and alone. Now, that's the very same little spot in the heart, which if you can open it, if you can kind of get inside in that loneliness, if you can, you know, clothe yourself in that loneliness, if you can put it on like a cloak and be there, I think that is really one of the great pathways in the spiritual journey. You begin to find in that moment that you're not alone. You begin to find that what you thought was your own lonely self is actually a kind of an immeasurable depth in your being, and that the depth in your being is alive with a kind of a presence, so that it feels, as I said earlier, like you're not looking into the universe or something. You feel the universe is watching you. And religious language can try and cope with that experience, but it really only gets you to the door. It doesn't get you inside the experience. And that's why I'm a storyteller, because sometimes telling stories like that one, and stories that are, just really from my experience. I mean, I felt this sense of the monk in this story was trying to share with me his attachment to his mother and how letting go of that attachment was his pathway to awakening and being a monk. And I felt, as I listened to him over many, many days, when he'd come back again and again to the same story, I felt he's telling a story and it's my story. This is me and my mother. So it's a funny thing, like, the sense of the mother in your life is so comforting. And sometimes it's a really good model for what is spiritual, because it feels sometimes like you're being mothered, that God is some sort of great, deep, all-pervasive, nurturing presence in your life. But there's also periods in your life, I think, where you feel cut off from mother. You feel like you've turned a corner and you've left it behind. Now, you'd have to read the end of that story to know what else happens in it, because there was a terrible and awful twist at the end of the story by that monk. But suffice it to say that when he was telling me the story, and we were walking around in various places in Mongolia, he's telling me the story. He's telling me a memory of the way things were, but are not like that anymore. He was telling me, this is the journey I made. This was my mother. This is how I loved her and how she loved me. Now, to actually tell the story, to remember the story, is to be outside it, is to have already drifted. And so it was his way of signaling to me, I am a person of faith. I am living on the inside. He probably would say with a Buddha mind. I would say with God. And I think that's how the spiritual path transcends the various institutional ways that try to regulate spirituality. Where Christianity or Buddhism or Hindu or Jew, Islam, they all try and regulate the pathway. But when you talk about the Sangha, when you talk about people who have faith, very often you can be looking in the eye with somebody who is a different creed than you, and yet you share something with them. And when he told me that story, it seemed to be like the journey from the mother to where he was in that moment was part of his spiritual journey. And I think that this, the first step is kind of leaving the mother. I think it's fierce important to remember your mother with love. And to be even selective about the memory, because sometimes you can have, 5,000 things about your mother that were beautiful and 4,500 things about her that were appallingly awful, where she was, not nice to you at all. But by filleting out the most beautiful memory, it seems to me that it's easier to walk away when everything is resolved. When I see my mother in heaven with the angels, rather than in the cold clay of a carven graveyard. When I see my mother embraced in the great Godhead, I can let go. You know, there's closure. You'd often hear people saying, she's at peace. Somebody's at peace. When somebody is at peace, you can let them go. And I think that in the mother story, it's so important to find something beautiful as the anchor of your cherishing, as the root of your remembrance. I think that that's the first step in spirituality. It's not the last. I think the next step is where you begin to experience the emptiness. You know, that terrible little nugget of emptiness inside, deep inside you, which makes you feel lonely and rotten and awful and alienated. That way of being in the world. How do you go into that space? How do you wear it like a cloak? It's easy for me to say, wear the loneliness like a cloak. Let it envelop you. How do you do that? And I'm going to be really disappointed because I don't know. I don't know. Maybe teachers know. Maybe wise people know. Or maybe it's a different answer for everybody, and maybe instinctively it's within yourself how to, rather than run away from the weakness inside you, the loneliness inside you, rather than run away from it, maybe instinctively everybody just knows how to embrace it. Because when you embrace this real depth, you know, I think that's where you begin to hear silence as the voice of God, as the language of the divinity. If you're able just to stick with that silence, and maybe silence is the technique, maybe silence of the body, stillness, silence of the mind, single-pointed meditation, silence of speech, keep your mouth shut and don't say anything. Maybe all these silences, this closing up of the body and the mind, and entering into that space of loneliness, of feeling bad in yourself, and just holding it there for a minute, holding it there for a very brief period. Maybe that's the technique. And in that moment, then you begin to feel, you know, this awfulness. This awfulness feeling is transforming into something different. There's somebody there. There's some sense of it is not me. It is not me who is here. And you'll find words fall away at that moment. You can only experience what comes next. And that's a very deep sense of love. I think that I understand why in many cultures and societies they used the idea of fatherhood for that condition or that experience. They used the word fatherhood because the idea of mother was so clearly to do with the physicality of nurturing the child after pregnancy. It was so clearly to do with something that you could see tangibly. Whereas to say, there's the mother, yes, and there's the father. Now, what do you mean the father? Because there's no evidence that he is the father. There's no umbilical cord here. It's just he did certain things with the mother and then a baby is born. So as a metaphor, the father kind of is a good choice. there's a sense of some kind of metaphysical intimacy. You can have a sense of God's presence, God's transcendence, God's being far away from you, and yet God being so close that He has created you, you know. Like your Father is the one whose seed, and from whom the seed came. I get older and I see my Father in the mirror. And His frailty and His death, His mortality, they too come to me as a lesson in mortality. But that's only my birth, Father. That's only a human thing. But if I go into the very, very secret room of my heart, the place where I feel alienated, the place where I feel uncomfortable, the place that I kind of constantly run away from because I want to engage with other people at a surface level, because I don't want to face up to this loneliness that's inside me. But then I go inside this loneliness. I go really, really into this room of loneliness. And when I'm in it for a while, I begin to feel I'm not alone. I begin to feel that if this is the true me, then it is other. It is like something beyond me that is penetrating me. Is looking at. I am being looked upon. It's not me looking into the dark. It is something out of the dark comes towards me, and it comes lovingly, and it begins to reassure me, and it begins to allow me to feel good. And then what was a bad thing, like a sense of alienation and loneliness, begins to turn into this sense of like a powerhouse, like a kind of a nuclear power plant of love. I feel it's just heating me. My whole body begins to heat up from the inside out with love, with a sense of, oh wow. And now I'm present in the world not like the fragile ego with the alienated, lonely bit inside him, but who misses mother, but I am my Father. You begin to hear words in the gospel. No one comes to me but through I and the Father are one. How do you pray? Go into the room of your heart and pray to your Father, and your Father who knows all things will hear you. So you see, the idea of father there is not about parental fatherhood. It's not about the kind of the shape, the template of fatherhood coming from human existence. It's simply a metaphor for the intimacy that exists at a metaphysical level, the downess that you feel when you look at the lake and you feel you belong at the shores of the lake. You feel like somebody's almost touching you. Well, there's nobody touching you in physical terms, in scientific terms. You're an individual conscious standing at the lake, but that's not how you feel. Really, it's not how you feel. You feel something is flowing into you. Some energy from the world around you is flowing into you. And you're receiving it, you're accepting it. How can you put a name on that relationship where there's no tangible connection? I always think that the motherliness of God that Julian of Norwich speaks about it's very like when people mind you, where things go well and where when you're lonely somebody turns up at your door and embraces you. People are so kind. People are so kind when you are low, when you are alone. People will reach out to you. And sometimes it's almost just the universe that reaches out to you. It's sometimes almost kind of an accidental way that something materializes, some wonderful gift materializes, some help, some pathway in life turns up. And they're all kind of very physical, intimate. It's like the nurturing motherliness of God is touching you all the time. And when you go out into the garden and you smell the roses, the wild roses, or the Albertine roses, beautiful wild rose we have here, and the scent of some of the trees at this time of year is extraordinarily rich, musky smell. It feels like you're in an outdoor cathedral. It feels that, like the pillars and the vaults of a medieval church have been transformed into the great pillars of oak trees and beech trees. And instead of the fragrance of the incense in the church, you're getting these beautiful musky fragrances from the trees. And you're experiencing the whole sense of being out there in the landscape as if it too were ritual prayer, as if you were involved in some great ritual, liturgical dance. And then the bees start singing and the birds sing, and you think choirs of angels are singing. And you feel the new, fresh, green, juicy leaves. And everything becomes the presence of God. And all that is very much like a motherly presence. And then there's the moment where you feel this rotten inside yourself, this alienated sense of loneliness. Because in reality you have been taken from the mother's womb, and you have grown up and you're an adult, and you have put her aside, or she has drifted into the past and she is a memory to you, and you miss her. And the emptiness is not missing her, but you don't know what the emptiness is. It's just this emptiness inside you. It's just this awful feeling sometimes. You don't feel good in yourself. And you want to run away from that. You want to do anything, entertain yourself or entertain other people in ways that keep you away from that particular awful sensation of loneliness. And this is the biggest, most difficult door to open. This is the secret room in the heart that you open. And you go in there. And you dress yourself in that loneliness. You say, yeah, I'm lonely. Yes, I am alienated. Yes, I'm even bitter. Yes, I'm panicking because life is nearly over. And I'm getting older and older, quicker and quicker. Yeah. And you just live with that. And it only takes a few moments. Be not afraid is the kind of word you hear. And you're experiencing this contradiction that here you are alone in a room in meditational pose, and you don't feel alone in a room. Here you are in brokenness and sorrow, and yet you feel some kind of whispering within that's full of joy. This is a very, very strange room to come into. But when you get there, I think you're experiencing the Father. A metaphor for the absolute, complete and total transcendence of God. The ground of being something so far away from us that we have no way towards it, no way to access it, and yet it is the ground, it's what holds us up. And yet, in our pain, we feel its presence draw closer. I can see that in the gospel. I can see it in the stories in the gospel are constantly about the journey towards Calvary, about the journey of experiencing God. In that way. I think that's what the Transfiguration is really about in some senses. You know, Jesus As James and John, they go up the hill, and the two boys see their brother, if you like, Jesus, transfigured, to see him in glory, connecting with Moses and Elijah, to see him in this linear complexity. It's as if they hadn't seen him up until now, and now they see him. What do they see? They see him in communion with Elijah, with Moses, in the great patristic tradition of connecting with this inner, secret room. Because when we touch the moment of God speaking to us in that silence, we see ourselves differently. We're no longer an individual. We are actually the expression of God in this moment. The Buddha would say, Buddhist, my friend the monk would say, enlightened mind, awakening to what we are, and the ego dissolving. That's a great space to be in. Difficult to get there because you have to go through this door, this kind of awfulness of what's inside there. I don't feel good in myself. That's the phrase to listen out for. And when you hear that phrase, rather than run away from it, rather than go down the road and say, I don't want to hear that, I'm going to be happy and go out there and meet people and just totally be dynamic and talk and be loud and just make enough noise so you never really hear what's inside you, because the little voice inside you is saying, I don't feel so good. And what happens is the dynamic of rushing away from what is inside you leaves you that you'll be running away from other people as well. Because what you get in other people is actually what's inside yourself. When I meet somebody like Rabsal, I meet the monk who tells me about his loneliness in relation to his mother, who tells me his pathway in life as a person of faith. I look at him like he is my brother, like even though I'm a Christian, he's a Buddhist, I look at him like he's my brother, and we share the same faith. We share the same sense of we are both men of faith. So you get from somebody what's inside yourself. And somebody who's very prayerful, they will uplift you. And somebody who's not will drag you down. They say in Buddhism, in Tibet, that, even if you put a stick of wood among the incense sticks, then eventually the stick of wood will smell of incense. And people around you lift you up or drag you down, because you will get in people what's in yourself. So if somebody reflects to you an energy of cynicism and selfishness, in some way they will trigger in you, awaken in you the same things. If you come in contact with somebody who's deeply compassionate, deeply mindful, deeply caring, you look in their eyes and you realize, we're the same, and that means that within me there is the same capacity for caring and compassion and love. And that's why it's amazing sometimes to meet somebody who is holy or wise. I have met Christian nuns who are holy. I've met Buddhist monks who are holy, and to be in their presence is just like, you could spend the whole day just being there with them, because they're lifting you up all the time. Their energy is like a mirror, and they give you courage to go inside. And I think that's what monastic tradition did for the wider community. You know, it was like the yeast in the bread. Everything was raised up, because when you had that monastic settlement in the center of the village or the town or the area, it was like there was this conscious awareness that in there are women or men who are dedicated to going into that room of the heart, living in there. And when you go into the room of the heart, what happens is it doesn't make you isolated. You become more anxious to go outside. So there is a flow from one to the other. Because you go out, you're no longer going out to people with a kind of a loneliness or emptiness inside you that you want to be healed because of your, you end up being attached to other people because you need them. You need somebody to heal your loneliness, or you need drugs, or you need something to heal it. But no, if you actually go into the heart, if you in meditational poise be still and know that God is God and present in you and with you, and you know that, you experience that, the one thing you want to do immediately is reach out to other people with a sense of joy. Now, I did not mean, but I could not stop myself. I did not mean to share like this. I chose that piece about the monk. I just thought I'd like to read this piece, and I'm glad I did. And I'm glad it led me to the reflections that I've just made. And I hope that they were okay for you. I hope that you feel the sense of joy that comes when you face up to being lonely, or face up to worries or anxieties, and when you go inside into that room, and in meditational ease and poise and stillness, begin to experience the silence as the very voice of God. It's the Father. It is the hidden one who is within you. That's what Jesus was saying. The hidden one within me speaks to you. That's what he was saying. I and my Father are one. Do you see what I mean? And it's very crucial. I think it's very crucial for our lives, because it was also very crucial for the life of Jesus, because that pathway towards faith, so that spiritual pathway, leads to the next step, the ultimate step, which is where Jesus is on the cross, and he said, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" I'm not going to go on about that today. It's too big, too terrible, and too beautiful. Except to say that the interesting distinction is he's been talking about Father as Abba, a word of intimacy and love and affection. In everything he's been saying about fatherhood. Fatherhood is within. And he's stretched on the cross, and he uses the line of a psalm to say something else. Eloi, Eloi, my God, my God. I think in some way, God as an external power collapses on Good Friday. Atheism is born on Good Friday. But so also atheism that has in the center of it another new, more intimate way of experiencing God as Father, Abba. I'd love to go on, but I'll have to stop I hope you're in a good place. I'm sending you really good wishes for this St. John's Eve. What a great feast. Bonfire night we used to call it. And we don't light the fires anymore, but we used to have a great time. So wherever you are, have many blessings. And thank you for being here. Bye-bye.